Perl programming language. In this nugget, we're going to talk about a very flexible and powerful programming language called Perl. We're going to go through some sample programs and compare and contrast those programs to shell scripts that we've already written. So let's get to work. Well, let's start our discussion of Perl by just talking a little bit about what it's good for. Certainly the kinds of things that we've done so far with shell scripts, we could also have written a Perl script to accomplish the same task. But Perl sign followed by the exclamation mark, but instead of putting the path to the shell, you're putting a path to the Perl interpreter /user/bin/Perl. Okay. Now the next line here is a comment, and this looks exactly like a comment in the Bash shell scripting language. As soon as we put a sharp sign on the line, the rest of the line is a comment, except for that first line that starts with sharp exclamation mark. Okay. Now the rest of this program is it's a pretty simple program, and all I'm trying to show in this program is how Perl handles numbers and strings. Okay, so the basic variable type in Perl is called a scalar, and a scalar can either be a number or it can be a string. And we already learned what strings were back in the last nugget. A string is just a series of characters and digits and things like that. Okay, so here what I've done is I've set up this variable called variable1 and I've set it equal to 5. Then I've set up this variable called variable2 and I've set it equal to the string 10. Okay, notice 10 is in quotes here, and it's the string 1 followed by 0. Okay, then there's variable 3, which is the string perfect. Okay, now what I can do is I can say variable 4 equals variable 1 plus variable 2. Okay, variable 1 is the number 5 and variable 2 is the string 10. But Perl doesn't care so much about that. Perl will do the conversion of the string 10 into the number 10, and then it'll let us do this arithmetic, store 5 plus 10, which is equal to 15, store that 15 into variable 4. Okay, and then the way to print out stuff in Perl is to use the command print, and then you follow that by a quoted string, just like we did in the Bash shell scripting language. We would here what we're saying is the fourth variable is equal to $variable4. This /n here says add a new line character, or like a carriage return, so that the next print statement doesn't show up on the same line. It'll show up on the next line down. Okay, so here it should say the fourth variable is equal to 15 because that's what 5 plus 10 is equal to. Okay? Notice one thing here about assigning variables and using variables is that in Perl, you always precede the variable by a $sign. Okay? In the Bash shell scripting language, if you were just setting a variable equal to 5 or something, you didn't need the $sign on the left-hand side. Okay? But you always need that $sign in Perl, whether the variable's on the left-hand side of an equation or the right-hand side. Okay? Now let's look at this line. This says variable 5 is equal to variable 3 period variable 2. Okay, so that period there, or the dot, is what's called the concatenation operator. So that sticks two strings together. So you use the concatenation operator on strings, and that will sort of blend the two strings into one string. Okay, so here variable 3 is perfect, variable 2 is 10, and so variable 5 would equal perfect 10. Okay, so when it prints out the fifth variable is equal to $sign variable 5, it'll go get the value of variable 5, substitute that into the print statement, so it'll say the fifth variable is equal to perfect 10. Okay, now let's just go out to the screen and run this program, go out to the command line and run this program, and we can run this program either by typing Perl test1.pl, and there's the answer that we expect. Fourth variable is equal to 15, fifth variable is equal to perfect 10. Notice there's no spaces in there, just concatenated those two strings together, just butt up right against each other. Okay. You can also run a Perl script the same way you ran Bash shell scripts. You can just say /test1.pl, and as long as you've made the script executable, then it will run in this fashion as well. Okay, so again, we get the exact same output because we haven't changed anything, and this is exactly what we were expecting. Okay, so Perl will do a conversion from a string to a number or a number to a string if it needs to make sense of things. What you couldn't do in Perl is add like perfect to 5. Okay, well, if it converts perfect to a number, what number would that be equal to? I have no idea, right? So you can't say here variable 4 equals variable 1 plus variable 3. Okay, Perl would sort of choke on that. What it would end up doing is just assigning variable 1 to variable 4. It would just assume that perfect is equal to 0 or something. Okay, so so you have to be careful because Perl will do a lot of conversion for you. Just make sure that it's doing the kinds of conversions that you're expecting it to do. All right, so that's our first Perl script. Now let's look at one that's slightly more complicated. Okay, well here's our second Perl script. It's called test2.pl, and in this Perl script we're doing something very similar to what we did in a shell script in the last nugget. Okay, we're going to go through the users on the system and look for the users that have an identification number between 500 and 1,000. But instead of just counting up the users that are normal users on the system, because what we did in the shell script was we just said there's like 4 normal users on your system, something like that. Okay, well what we're going to do now is instead of just saying there's 4 normal users on your system, we're going to print out the names of the users that are normal users. So we're going to print out like Perry, Annie, Chuck, Dennis, that sort of thing, okay, which are the normal users on our system that we added back in that user administration nugget. Okay, so to accomplish this, we use a special variable in Perl called an array, and we start arrays with the @ sign. So the @ sign there says this is an array of names. This is an array of IDs. Okay, so let's move out to the whiteboard just to talk about arrays a little bit and just kind of get an idea of what they are and how they're structured. Then we're going to come back and interpret exactly what this program's doing, and you can see how to use arrays in an actual Perl script. Okay, so what is an array in Perl? Well, an array is a collection of objects, or a list of objects in some sense. Okay, and the way that you can assign a set of objects to a particular array is you can say @names equals, then you do these curly braces, which are right over the square brackets on the keyboard, and then inside of those curly braces you can make a whole list, Larry, comma, Mo, comma, curly, and this list can be as long or as short as you want. Okay, now what this does is it assigns Larry to the array names, it assigns Mo to the array, and it assigns Curly to the array. Okay, so this is how you would assign these values to this array names in Perl. Okay, but pictorially I like to think about it like this. Okay, that names is the name of this box. Okay, and then it's got indexes, index 0, index 1, index 2. In the 0 box is the first name Larry, in the 1 box is the name Mo, and in the 2 box is the name Curly, because that's the order they were given in this assignment statement. Okay, so this is the way I like to think about it pictorially. And then if I want to print out Mo, for instance, well, what I can do is I can say print, and then I can say $ names square brackets 1. Okay, so now this prints out a particular element, a particular scalar value in this array names. It's going to print out the thing at index 1, and from our picture you can see index 1 is Mo. So the result of this print statement, it will print out Mo to the screen. Okay, so there's the basic idea of how arrays work. Now let's move back out to the Linux screen and see arrays in action. Alright, so now let's go through this Perl script, test2.pl, carefully now that we understand a little bit more about arrays. Okay, so the way that we saw back on the whiteboard to give values to an array, I'm just going to type it in here so that we can compare it. We said something like @names equals parentheses Larry, Mo, and Curly. Okay, then we did square curly braces, semicolon. And this put Larry into names at index 0, this put Mo into the array names at index 1, and this put Curly into the array names at index 2. Okay, well, we're not going to do things like that in this particular example. What we're doing in this example is we're putting the values into the names array via a command, okay, via a shell command. Now here you can see I'm using backticks, and the backticks here mean the exact same thing as backticks meant in shell scripting. We're going to run a command inside of the backticks, and then the output of that command is going to go into the variable on the left-hand side of this assignment statement. Okay, so what's going into this variable names? Well, what we're doing is we're printing out the password file, then we're cutting out the first field of the password file using colon as the delimiter. Okay, so we did almost this exact same command a few times now already in different shell scripts, both in the last nugget and in the introductory videos. And what this does is it pulls out the first field of the etc password file, which are the usernames. Okay, so it's going to take the first username and put that in the array names at index 0, and that username happens to be root. Okay, so a names array at index 0 is going to hold the username root. Okay, then the names array at index 1 is going to have the next name in the etc password file, which I don't know off the top of my head. Let's just say it's called the FTP user. Okay, so FTP is in the names array at index 1, and so on. Okay, good. Now, the IDs array, that array is going to be filled with values, and that's going to be filled with values in almost the exact same way. We're going to print out the password file, but now we're going to cut out the third field using colon as the delimiter. Okay, the third field of the etc password file is the identification numbers. Okay, so here what we're doing is we're saying at IDs, the array IDs at index 0 is going to be the identification number of the first user in etc password. Okay, now notice the correlation between these two arrays. The names array at index, say, like 13, okay, is going to hold some username. Well, what's in the IDs array at index 13? Well, it's going to be the identification number of the name at index 13 in the names array. Okay, so these two arrays are what we call like parallel arrays, or like, you know, they're like a team. Okay, they both hold data from the password file, and unless the password file changed miraculously in between when we ran these two commands, they're going to be, you know, they're going to team up here. And the names array at index 10 and the IDs array at index 10 are going to be values for the exact same user on the system, the name of that user and the identification number of that user. Okay, good. So now we understand how the names array and the IDs array are filled with values. Now what we do is we say length here, $length, is equal to @IDs. Well, what is this @IDs? @IDs is an array. It's an array. It holds a whole bunch of elements. Okay, holds all the different identification numbers for all the users on the system. How can we assign that to a scalar variable like length, which is supposed to hold numbers or strings? Well, what happens in Perl when you say $length is equal to some array? What gets stored in $length is the number of items in that array. Okay, or the length of the array is the way I like to think of it. So if there's like 25 identification numbers in the IDs array, then $length here will be equal to 25. Okay, then we use $I here, and we start at equal to 0, and it's just going to serve as a counter, or it's going to help us index the elements of the two arrays here. Okay, so that's the preliminaries for this particular program. Then what we do is we just issue this print statement. We say the normal users on your system are, and then we put in this new line character, and then we're going to execute this while loop to actually print out all the names of the normal users on the system. Okay, so let's look at this while loop first just at the outer level. So at the outer level, what we're saying here is while $I is less than length. Now we should be able to read this since we've already read while loops in the shell scripting language. The syntax is not exactly the same. Okay, we use the less than sign instead of saying like minus LT. Okay, there's no like do associated with the while, and there's no done associated with the while. Okay, what we do to signify the beginning of the while loop is we use one curly brace, then we use another curly brace down here to signify the end of the while loop. Okay, so it's a little bit more terse, if you will, in Perl because there's not as many words and things like that, but it gets just as easy to read once you've read a few Perl programs. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're saying while I is less than length, do all the stuff in between those two curly braces. Okay, notice here, so that's what's going to happen. At the beginning, I is equal to 0 and length is equal to the the number of elements in this array. And so I is equal to 0, length is equal to say 30 or something like that. So this is true. Okay, so since it's true the first time, then we're going to go in and execute all this code in between the two curly braces. Now, what is the code that's getting executed between these two curly braces? Let's explain that carefully. Okay. Now inside of here, this if statement that's inside of here is just like we saw with if statements in the bash shell scripting language. We're going to test some condition here, and if this condition is true, then we'll do the stuff in between this curly brace and this curly brace. Okay, so again, the syntax is a little different. There's no like phi here to signify the end of the if statement. You don't have to use the word then with the if statement. Okay, so again, Perl is a little bit more economical in its syntax than the bash shell scripting language was. Okay, so now what's going on inside of this if statement? Let's make sense of that. Okay, remember that $I here is equal to 0 the first time through the loop. So what we're saying is look at the 0 index of the IDs array. Okay, and determine if it's greater than or equal to 500. So the way we do greater than or equal in Perl is we just say to it if you want to learn more about Perl. All right, well, it's time to wrap up our nugget on the Perl programming language. And we started by talking about Perl and what it's good for. We talked about the structure of a Perl program, how it starts with the shebang / user bin Perl. Then we talked about scalar variables. Okay, these are sort of the most basic variables in Perl. And the scalar variables hold either numbers or strings. Okay, and we saw how Perl could convert strings to numbers if it needed to do arithmetic. So it was very smart about being able to convert between these two data types. Then we talked about if statements and while loops, and we saw that they were basically the same as what we learned back in the bash shell scripting nugget. Okay, the syntax in Perl is a little bit different than it is in the shell scripting language, but the idea, the concept of what an if statement and a while loop is identical. Okay, then we talked about those array variables. And in our example programs, those array variables, one of them was called names. And we signified that it was an array variable by using that @ sign in front when we assigned values to it. Okay, and remember that these arrays held a whole bunch of elements, like a collection of elements, and we referred to those individual elements by the index in the array. And the first index, the first element in the array is always indexed by number 0, the next one by number 1, the next one by number 2, and so on. And finally, we talked briefly about subroutines. Subroutines is a very complicated idea in programming languages in general, and I just introduced them briefly, showed you how to call a subroutine, and also showed you a very simple one that I wrote. Okay, and the idea here is where you're really probably going to use subroutines more in your Perl programming experience is calling subroutines that other people have written to accomplish tasks, especially if you start including the various modules and stuff that come with Perl. Well, I hope you found this nugget informative, and thanks for watching.